many cameras have you got?
This setup is really just for show, although all of these cameras will feature in some way within this video, but I am concentrating on some key cameras within this, and they are the new DJI Osmo Action, the GoPro Hero 7 here in its black dusk white edition, and the Osmo Pocket, and also the GoPro Hero 6 black. I'll explain why a little bit later on. In this video, I am going to be concentrating on looking in detail at the image of the cameras and also stabilization. I will be looking at operation a little bit, but really it's about these two key factors. In regards to image, I'll be looking at the dynamic range, image detail, picture profiles, the auto exposure handling, and low light. And then of course stabilization will cover everything stabilization wise, obviously. Now I don't actually do the whole action thing, but I use these cameras, and it's being GoPros. Driving shots, I would say, is probably the biggest ones of getting cameras inside and outside of cars. Slightly more exotic, on CNN's The Wonder List, we use loads of GoPros underwater.
I'd always heard that diving in Galapagos was special, but my goodness, look at this.
And before DJI had cameras on their drones, I used GoPros on drones. In fact, my award-winning film, Ko Yanoi, was shot with a GoPro. And whilst the GoPro image out of the camera isn't very nice, you can do lots of things with it. Let's see if we can do the same sort of things with the Osmo Action. A camera's picture profile can literally make or break the image. Generally, out of the box settings that you get with most of these cameras tends to be on the unpleasant side, incredibly over sharpened, contrasty, and overly saturated. To capture the best dynamic range, and of course to give you more options when it comes to grading in post, you want your camera to have a profile that is as flat as possible. Both the DJI Osmo Pocket and the Osmo Action have two main picture profile modes, normal mode and the D-Cine-like mode. I'd always recommend using the D-Cine-like because it just has an easier image for grading. Straight out the box, if you're not going to do any grading, then sure, use the normal, but nah, use Cine-like. But there's no ability to change any of the settings, the contrast, sharpness, nothing at all. It's a massive pain. The Osmo Action does have one extra mode, and that is the HDR mode, and this does hold more of our dynamic range, which I'll talk about more in the dynamic range bit. This gives you no ability to tweak the image at all. There is still no sharpening options, and there's also no ability to change your exposure value. So if you feel that it is a little bit hot, a little bit dark, tough luck, that is what you get. And really HDR does need a 10-bit codec, and this is an 8-bit codec. All of these cameras are 8-bit codecs. And the biggest downside to the HDR mode is the rock steady stabilization. It doesn't work in this mode. Hence, these shots are on a tripod. Now the GoPros here do actually have a rather nice profile. It's called Pro Tune. And when you set it, make sure your color is also set to flat and not GoPro color. And turn your sharpness to low. That is all you need to do with the GoPro profile. and that will give you the nicest images to work with in post and give you the best dynamic range. The sharpness setting is so important. If you set it to higher than low, all it's doing is in-camera digital sharpening. You can do this yourself in post. What you can't do is bring that sharpness down. Sony's X3000 is not a new camera, it's been out about 2 or 3 years now. And it doesn't have a lot of ability to change the settings. In fact, it doesn't really have much at all. It has the vivid or it has the neutral, which is what we're seeing here. There's no ability to change the sharpening in this, and it looks fine until you zoom in, and that's when you see the issues. Now take a look at this. This is the RX0, which is the 1-inch small camera. It's not an action camera, but it looks like one. This is actually HD. I'm not recording 4K because you need the RX0 Mark II to record internally on 4K. This one only does it as HD internally. But look at the detail on this from HD. A big part of why this looks so good is it is a much larger sensor. It's a 1-inch sensor. Plus it has much nicer glass. And also I expect the processing is a lot better. When it comes to the codec, it's actually very similar codec to the Osmo Action and the Osmo Pocket, which is H.264, 100 megabits per second. And this isn't even that because this is HD, this is only 50 megabits a second. It's the 4K, which is 100 megabits per second. When using the GoPro Hero 7, do make sure you select H.265 or HEVC. This is the way to record things. It's a little bit harder to edit with, but it is much more efficient. It's a much better codec. Effectively, it is much less compressed.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9.
The bit rates do vary though depending on what frame rate you are shooting at. So this is 4K 50p on the Osmo Action, and it is slowed down for slow motion. In 50p, the bit rate is the same as 25p, which is 100 megabits per second in H.264. But it's capturing twice as many frames. So in essence, it's actually only 50 megabits per second. And there's some definite issues going on the ground there, as you can see. It just can't cope with this amount of detail at this bit rate. So this is the same shot on the Osmo Pocket, same frame rate. It is the same bit rate, it's the same sensor, and this is very revealing. I'm thinking the reason why it doesn't have as many issues is because it's not as wide. So therefore there's less information, less detail to compress. It is the same resolution, but definitely less going on in that screen. I'm just guessing here, there could be something completely different. There are a few issues, but nothing like we had on the Action. With the GoPro recording in H.265, which is HEVC, the numbers look lower, but the compression method is much more efficient. It does depend on what's being captured, but a conservative estimate, it's roughly twice as efficient. But be careful, if you're set to H.264 in the menus, you'll get the same bitrate numbers as H.265, but without that efficiency, without that superior codec. And your numbers, your bitrate numbers will be lower than the Osmo Action. The 4K 50p is recording at about 78 megabits per second H.265. So just times that by 2 to get a rough equivalent of what that would be in H.264, so 156 megabits per second. So likewise with the Osmo Action in slow motion 50p, where you are stretching out that codec, you're looking at 78 megabits per second, equivalent in H.264 compared to the Osmo Action's 50 megabits per second. You with me? I was going to talk about every single bitrate for every single resolution and every single frame rate, but it's going to take forever to do that. So I'm going to put them all up on the screen right now so you can pause it and have a look. And it is interesting, certainly when you go to the high frame rates, you are getting a very thin codec at times. I would say that all of the camera's bit rates are being stretched for what is being asked of them with all of this detail. In slow motion mode, you really are stretching things a lot, and you can definitely see the results of that when you're looking at your footage. None of this is surprising. These are not big professional camcorders, they are small action cameras. The fact that the GoPro Hero 7 Black can record in H.265 HEVC is a big deal. These cameras are deep depth of field, everything's in focus, wide angle, and they're pretty much always moving, which is a nightmare for compression. That is why a really good codec is ideal, and one that has the least amount of compression. And in this situation, it's actually the GoPro. Sharpness and detail are two very different things and mustn't be confused, but people do get them confused. Now look, this shot here is the GoPro. It is set to Pro Tube and the sharpness is set to low in camera. On the right hand side, I've taken that shot and pushed up the sharpness to 100% in Premiere, which looks exactly the same as if I'd set the GoPro to high sharpness in camera. For sure, the one which is sharper pings more, but it doesn't add any more detail, as we can see from cropping in. The image on the right may fool you into thinking there's more detail. It's just that edge sharpening is making things stand out a little bit more, but it is ugly. The other thing you're doing when you're pushing up that sharpness is you are highlighting the noise, and they've all got noise in the images because they are such small sensors with so much resolution. High sharpness shows up the noise way more than low sharpness. Now, with the GoPro in the flat mode, I would actually recommend pushing it up a little bit anyway, because it is a little bit too soft. And when you put it back to full screen away from that nasty crop, it actually looks really nice. None of these cameras can withstand this amount of cropping. Well, not these cameras. To really emphasize this photograph was taken with the GFX 50S, which has a resolution of 8256 by 6192 pixels. Way more than your GoPro and Osmo Action, which is of course 3840 by 2160, which is 4K. There is no sharpening in this image at all. This is from the RAW. Now the metadata does give it sharpening, and I've just turned it off. And you can see how natural it is. You're zooming really massively into my face, sorry about that. And you can see every detail, too much detail. So this image, it does ping like this. That's because I pushed up the sharpening in post to match what it would look like if I was pushing it up in camera. Now it has the same amount of detail, it's the same sensor, it's the same lens, the same photograph. By adding the sharpness, it makes things look really quite nasty. The detail was actually still in there, but by adding the sharpness either in camera or in post, you're making it look pretty awful. Side by side, left is natural and right is with the digital sharpening. Please tell me you don't like the one on the right. Having lots and lots of detail isn't always a great thing, and on portraits it can show flaws. Believe it or not, I do actually have some flaws in my face, quite a few. So I am softening it now. I'm actually just using Film Convert, the softening tool within it. And yeah, don't go too far, just a little bit. And while I'm there, I'm just going to remove that little blemish. So there you go. And to really emphasize this point, this image is much more compressed, and you can see the macro blocking that happens with the sharpness. We are at the mercy of many factors with our action cameras. We're at the mercy of the resolution, the sensor, the lens, the amount of light we have, of course, the codecs, and the profiles. And that's why I want my cameras to have the ability to turn my sharpness off, or at least reduce it. I don't want to be stuck with over-sharpened images that really I can't do much with in post. To show you what could be possible from the Osmo Action, away from its preset very sharpened image, we can take a photograph, because in RAW, not JPEG, in RAW, we have the ability to set our sharpness to 0. So we can see what it is actually capable of if we were able to turn our sharpness down. There, detail versus sharpness. I use Film Convert a lot for my color grading, and I also do use it to try and bring down the sharpness in post. It isn't easy and takes a fair bit of work. Using the softness option on there, adding a bit of film grain, you can get some okay results, but you'll never get it as nice as if it started off without all that artificial sharpening.
It's okay. Okay.
Lollipop. Hey. Is this enough for your first attempt? The DJI Osmo Pocket is most definitely not an action camera. It's not wide enough, for starters. It's not robust enough, it's not waterproof. But it is an incredibly cool thing. A 3-axis mechanical gimbal this sort of size is just amazing. It does have the same sensor and a very similar image to the Osmo Action, but it's that size. It's just so handy and I always have it with me. When the Osmo Pocket first came out, there was only the normal colours, there was no cine-like option. Not long after getting it, I shot this down in Bournemouth in the standard mode. Actually, this really has no grading on it. These are the colours straight out of camera. It did help that I had a really lovely sunny day. On a not so nice day, it would have been much more challenging. This shot is probably my most traditional style gimbal shot, just following somebody, but look at the others, there's very little movement, very subtle, some static shots. Just remember, if you are moving, make sure there's something driving the shot to make it move. I was really impressed with how the Osmo Pocket performed here, because snow is one of the hardest things to deal with compression. But even though I wasn't able to use the cine-like profile at this point, it turned out pretty good. And if you see the full piece, it cuts in really well with the DJI Mavic Pro 2. The camera's dynamic range is arguably, well, it is more important than having that high resolution. What we can hold in the highlights and shadows is incredibly important, especially as these cameras tend to be set to auto because we aren't able to change our settings because we are jumping out of a plane or whatever. Well, I'm not, but you get the point. This is a very extreme test. We have bright sky outside and dark inside, and it's a challenge for all of the cameras. On the Osmo Action we could use spot metering, but I don't want to do that because what I want to do is just see how it meters the whole frame and what it does to keep the exposure. Can we bring back any of those highlights? The shadow areas are pretty dark. Let's see what happens when we lift those. As expected, it is very noisy. It is really struggling with this extreme dynamic range test. So this is where we want to try the HDR mode. And for the most part, it did a pretty good job. Although it feels like it has lifted the shadows a little bit too much and it hasn't held the highlights enough. So in an ideal world, you'd want to be able to change your exposure point with a spot exposure or something on this sort of shot, and there is no option in HDR mode. There's no option to change any of your EV setting. And the auto exposure, as you can see on this shot, can be a little bit on the aggressive side, and it does kind of ruin this particular shot. The GoPro did a pretty good job, and I felt that it definitely held more of the highlights and the shadows for sure. It does help that it has a flatter profile. Having that Pro Tune flat definitely does a much better job. Some shadow noise is expected, of course. The Sony X3000 was okay. It did hold the shadows actually quite well, but there was some highlight clipping. I wasn't able to bring it back, of course. So overall, not too bad, but not great either. Time to get onto something a bit more realistic. Let's go back to Richmond Lock. I will be getting on to stabilization very soon, I promise. This is just a really good example of another real world dynamic range test, much more realistic. We have bright on the left and dark on the right. The shadow information is not really there on the Action. The Pocket has the same sensor. It's definitely seeing much more in the shadow information. It's a little bit hot in the sky, but I think I can bring that back, or most of it. And then looking at the GoPro in ProTune, it seems to be pretty well balanced. Yes, it is a little bit hot on the sky, but from what I've seen already, I can bring that back. When I'm shooting with cameras without log profiles, I tend to shoot with my exposure value compensation set around -0.5 or -0.7. I left it at 0 here just to make it fair, and also because the GoPro has the increments of half stop EVs, whereas the DJI cameras have 1/3 stops, and I couldn't get it to be exactly the same. So I left it at 0. And the reason why I tend to have it minus is because video tends to hold shadows better than it holds highlights. This isn't smooth, but this is. This is the Osmo Action with Rocksteady turned off whilst walking. And the GoPro Hero 7 will be the same with Hypersmooth turned off. I think we can all agree it looks awful. And how did we get past this before? How did we stabilize our action cameras? Well, we put them on gimbals, 3-axis mechanical gimbals. How quaint. Let's give it a try. Slow path. Rocksteady mode, which is the electronic stabilization on the DJI Osmo Action, is terrific. It is one of the standout features of the camera. Of course, you've already heard about this by now, but the DJI version is really, really good. Slow path. This is GoPro's version, and it's called Hypersmooth, and it's on the Hero 7 Black. It's not quite as good in my opinion, but it's still very good. It's in this area that the DJI Osmo Action definitely shines over the GoPro. And I've also found that the 2.7K mode in both cameras, especially in 4x3 mode, actually gives us better results. Slow path. And this is shot with the Osmo Pocket, which uses a mechanical 3-axis gimbal. Apart from the smoothness, you can tell because it has a much tighter field of view, unlike the action cameras. Now this is better, it is more stable, especially on the horizon. And it always helps when doing these shots if you are motivating the shot. This means there's something that is driving the movement of your camera. The person who's moving, say following them. It's much more natural than just doing a walking shot with nothing else, because you will see the bounce much more. If you have something to focus on, it hides it really well. The version you just saw of this shot was on the Pocket, which is the 3-axis gimbal. I find it incredible that this is done using electronic stabilization on the Action. The only thing letting this shot down is that really heavy auto exposure that's going on. I really would love to have better control over that. It's a shame the HDR mode doesn't work in the Rocksteady mode. Slow path. I almost forgot about the X3000, and I shouldn't do because it does have stabilization. It has optical image stabilization, which is much more natural and organic. It feels much more like handheld. It may not have the wow factor of Rocksteady or Hypersmooth, but in quite a few situations Optical image stabilization is exactly what you're after. I'm sure you've all been paying attention, and I'm sure you all noticed this shot here and what I wrote in the text: GoPro Hero 6, no internal stabilization, yet it's steady. And a GoPro 6 does have electronic stabilization. It's okay, it's nowhere near as good as the Hypersmooth or the Rocksteady, yet how does it look as good as this? Here's that walking up the stairs shot which I opened this section with, and magically it became super stable. It was shot with the GoPro Hero 6. And the key thing about this camera, as well as the Hero 5 Black, the Hero 5 Session, the Hero HD from 2018, the Hero 6 Black and the Hero 7 Black, slow pan off, is that they all have a gyro, and it saves the data to the video file, and then you use a piece of software called Real Steady Go. It costs $99. It analyzes all of that gyroscopic motion and it stabilizes it in post. And it does an incredible job, I have to say. It's not as quick and easy as Rocksteady or Hypersmooth, of course, but if you don't have one of these nice new cameras, there is this alternative. You just select the clip you want to stabilize, it analyzes the gyroscopic data. You may need to put in a couple of marks in there just to point out where things drastically change. You may want to trim it, and maybe select lock horizon if you want it really steady, and then you just let it render and export. It's that easy. You will be cropping into your image, so you will lose some of your field of view and some of your resolution. But it's a trade-off that I think most of us will be happy to pay. You may think, I don't need to spend $99, I will just use Warp Stabilize. The key to Real Steady is all of that gyroscopic information that is recorded whilst you're filming embedded in the video file. Warp Stabilize can't read that. 2.7K 25p. I would much rather just have Rocksteady already in your camera. But if your camera doesn't have it, it's one of the ones I've already mentioned that is supported. This is a really great option. I know you're going to ask this question, so I'm answering it. Can you use the Osmo Action with Real Steady? Because the HDR mode doesn't work with Rocksteady. Sadly, you can't. The amount that Real Steady crops in is totally dependent on the amount of motion you have. Let's take a look at how much Rocksteady and Hypersmooth crop in when engaged on the cameras. Obviously you are losing field of view, but you're gaining so much by that amazing stabilization. I worked it out to be about 18% crop of your image to get it. But the more you move, the more it will crop. It's not a lot of movement right now because it's on a tripod, so 18% minimum. The Hypersmooth mode of the GoPro doesn't crop as much as the Rocksteady. My calculations made it about 10% on this static shot, so obviously that will increase with movement. And here's a quick comparison to see the field of view of the wide mode on both of the cameras. As you can see, the GoPro is slightly wider. And actually, the Sony X3000 is wider than both of them. The GoPro does have one extra wide shot, and it is called Super View, and I did use it for these shots. It is nice to have, but it's not essential. The normal wide view is more than enough for most things. I suppose you actually want to see what it looks like. Okay. This is meta because this is the sequence in Adobe Premiere of the video you're watching right now, and this is the wide view on the GoPro, and this is Super View. We're seeing a little bit more information on the left and right, but a lot more on the top and bottom. And that's because this is based upon the 4:3 mode, so it's using the whole sensor rather than 16:9. It's good to have, but it is a bit squished and won't be very flattering for people close up. A big plus for the Osmo Action is its de-warp mode. This is nothing to do with this transition, this is just me getting a little bit bored with the edits. It's taken so long to do. This works in all resolutions and all frame rates apart from HD, the highest frame rates are 200 and 240 frames per second. And it also works with Rocksteady. And it basically de-warps the image, it makes it look less fisheye. It's very nice. GoPro has a similar mode, it's called linear mode, but it only works in 2.7K. That's it. One slight quirk with the Rocksteady is there is a lag on the rear screen from what you're actually recording. It is strange. I'm hoping it will be reduced in a later firmware update. It's so tempting to keep Rocksteady and Hypersmooth turned on these cameras because it keeps everything so smooth. The thing is, there are types of shots where you don't want it to be on. Let's take a look at car mounting shots, for example. If you can't see any of the car, then I would say yes, keep it turned on because it keeps everything beautiful and smooth. But if you can see the car that it's mounted on, then you're going to have a smooth background and the car bouncing around and it looks weird. But with the stabilization turned off, then your vehicle is going to be nice and static within the frame and the bouncing is going to be on the road, whatever. It looks so much more real. But hey, if you like the other look, I'm not going to tell you not to do it. I don't think you should do it. The only cameras from this I haven't talked about yet are the 360-degree ones. We have the Evo from Insta360 and the Pro 2 and the Insta360 One X. Oh, and also the GoPro Fusion, which is actually very good and gives you great results. It's just the workflow is not much fun. I'm not using a 360 camera to go in a headset. I'm using it so I can choose any angle I want in post because it records everything. It is an incredible tool. This is the whole image that has been recorded. It stabilizes in a very similar way to the cameras we've been talking about today, using gyroscopic data. The software takes that gyroscopic data and applies it to the footage to make it super stable. It's also in the software that you choose the direction, the field of view, the frame that you want to see, and then you export it as a video file. You can also choose the aspect ratio for whatever you want, 16:9, 1:1, or even god-awful vertical 9:16. And you can create things like little planets, but you can also just let your creativity run riot. Unlike Rocksteady and Hypersmooth, there's no concerns about cropping the image because it's captured the entire 360 sphere. It's got all of that image to play with to create that great stabilization. The selfie stick that it's on gets cancelled out because it's between the two lenses. Anything between those two lenses, it disappears, hence it's called an invisible selfie stick. It's not really invisible. I'm holding both of the cameras here, the One X and the Fusion, and from the Fusion you can see the One X on its selfie stick. And this is all you can see of the Fusion selfie stick. The potential from these 360 cameras is unlimited. The biggest downside we have right now to the technology is actually resolution. The One X says it has 5.7K, and it does, but that's for the entire sphere, for everything that it captures. When you are only capturing a small portion of that, the resolution is a lot lower. And that's where 360 cameras fall down, comparing them to cameras like the Osmo Action. We may have 5.7K on the Insta360, but by the time we zoom into the part of the image that we actually want to export, it's way lower, probably less than 1080p. But the 4K that we're using of the Osmo Action, we're using all of that, so the image is so much better. The Insta360 Pro 2 is actually 8K, so it has much more resolution to play with, and you can do the same sort of thing. Because we're capturing with so much more resolution, when we zoom in, it's so much better. But its weight combined with a monopod to use it like this is not practical. The monopod was cancelled out, but that wasn't the only thing.
Some hearts may
kidding. I have a very in-depth review of the Insta360 One X, where I explain all of this in way more detail and loads of examples. These are not low light cameras, which I expect they've got tiny sensors. And it is something that I would really like from an action camera, is one that does work in low light. The stabilization does still work okay, despite the fact there's not a lot of light. There's a lot of noise though. Can you clean it up with neat video? Yeah, a little bit, but it does go a little bit plasticky. The DJI Osmo Pocket's low light performance was actually a bit better than the Action, interestingly. I don't know why. The HDR mode of the Osmo Action actually does quite impressive things when it comes to low light. And there's Jimmy. Hello. Hi Bert. 1600 ISO on the GoPro, got no stabilization on right now. Hi Purse. What's it like? Do you think it's any good? The GoPro doesn't look like it's got as much noise in these shots, but I really think that's just down to some aggressive noise reduction because it looks really mushy. I mean, really mushy. But then again, it's always a little mushy. This isn't any new mush. Slow pow. It's really hard to say what is my favourite of the action cameras. For me, the GoPro does have a nicer image. It doesn't have as many artifacts, it has a better codec, and it's not overly sharpened. The Osmo Action has better stabilization. It's nicer to use and nicer to operate. The front screen is a really nice touch. It's just a shame that you can't have both screens on at the same time. And there's loads of other comparisons like battery life and audio quality, which have been covered by loads of people. It's just too much depth to get into in this one video, and I've covered so much. I've been using GoPros for so long and I'm so familiar with them, but I'm really enjoying using the Osmo Action. If DJI can just fix these key issues when it comes to the image quality. Maybe they can add H.265 encoding, I don't know. The least I would like to see is some controls for our image. To be able to bring down our contrast and our sharpness, and also to have some control with our exposure in HDR mode. These are cameras which are used by so many different types of people, from people just making home movies, to people like myself using them in their filmmaking, to even in big budget movies. Of course, professionals using them want all these controls, but I also believe consumers should have the option to control their image much more. Of course, some will be very happy with what they get out the box, but why not just give the option of having both? If they can improve the image of the Action through firmware and also maybe reduce that lag, then I think GoPro really do have a challenger to the action camera supremacy that they have. That's it for me. These cats need feeding. What do you think, Harriet? You're beautiful girl. Your story is on YouTube. People should watch it. It's amazing.